Bom dia, vamos dar início à última conversa deste simpósio Godard. Como sabem, Godard é um dos focos do festival este ano, com a exibição integral da sua obra e durante este fim de semana um simpósio em que participam vários dos nossos convidados e temos hoje connosco à direita o crítico de cinema Álvaro Arroba, o escritor LEFFEST'16, que também tem escrito muito sobre cinema e nomeadamente em várias publicações ou em textos para as edições que a Criterion tem vindo a fazer de muitos filmes clássicos e nomeadamente de alguns também de Jean-Luc Godard, como o Vivo sa vie, que é ainda exibido hoje. O LEFFEST' colaborou, por exemplo, também com o Martin Scorsese no filme Gangs of New York. E temos o Jonathan Rosenbaum, crítico e ensaísta, que nos tem acompanhado ao longo de todo este simpósio, e João Mário Grilo, realizador e professor. Thank you all for being with us here. Maybe, Jonathan, you could start with it, because today we could speak a little about the last films of Jean-Luc Godard, but at the same time this could be a resume of what the conclusions of what we have discussing here in the symposium. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's in a way it's the last works of Godard that, for many people, are the most difficult. But at the same time, there's a simplicity that comes from the fact that they are films of the country rather than films of the city, which is one way you can sort of distinguish between the first period and the most recent period. And in between, it's hard to say, well, like for the films of the Ziga Vertov period, they're neither city nor country films. They're somewhere in between. And of course, the series for television also comes in the middle, in which there are many different ways of trying to engage with the public, in a sense. But at the same time, it seems to me that Godard is only interested in engaging with the public now in very odd and interesting ways, by things like using 3D in Adieu à Langage, or including Patti Smith briefly in
Film Socialism.
In Film Socialisme. But they're really, the late films are really, it seems to me, Godard ruminating to himself to a certain extent. And I think that they're very free films in a way that even the earlier ones are not, I think, because one thing I learned from, I wish I could remember his name, this wonderful assistant he works with on all of his films now, who's based in Switzerland, who said to me, I'm not a Godard fan. I met him in Zagreb earlier this year. He said, I'm not a Godard fan, but I love working with Jean-Luc. And when he was making Film Socialisme, Godard booked 2 passages on this luxury ocean liner, and he took used the first ticket himself and shot. And then he said for the second, he said to his assistant, you can either go or not go as you choose, and if you go, you don't have to shoot, but if you want to shoot, you can. And so he decided to go on the second voyage of the ship, and he did shoot, and a lot of his material is in the film. But Godard was completely free about whether he would shoot at all and what he would shoot. He didn't tell him what to shoot either. So I think that points to the fact that Godard is very much open to things. I mean, there's an early phrase of his that it comes from the first period when he says he wants to achieve the destiny by chance. And it seems to me that that's a kind of calling card for all of his work to a certain extent. And in a way, it's the same kind of dialectic that you see in the work of Jacques Rivette, because Rivette was someone who wanted to include the kind of freedom of shooting of somebody like Rossellini or Jean Renoir, and then to counter this freedom with the rigor of someone like Fritz Lang in the editing. So in a sense, that's another way of sort of combining, chance and destiny. It seems to me. I think it's kind of remarkable that Godard should turn out to be the one survivor of the Nouvelle Vague. That who would have guessed that he would have, considering how much he smokes, that he would be the last one standing, so to speak. And the one who is still changing. I mean, I think one person who's left out often from the Nouvelle Vague, who it seems to me in some ways took even more risks than Godard, is Alain Resnais. Even though he worked within a much more commercial framework, every film that Resnais made was a new departure and something completely different from what he had done before, more than, it seems to me, even Godard. And in that sense, he took enormous risks and consequently had many more projects that he was never able to get off the ground and so on. But it seems to me that Resnais is often left out of that movement because he wasn't a critic and because he sort of accepted the more industrial kind of model for making films. But I think he's obviously very important to Godard because, I mean, the references to L'année dernière à Marienbad in Histoire du Cinéma are kind of central, for example. I think one of the things that's also very striking about the later work of Godard is that sound becomes more important, much more important. Starting with Detective, when he had made his first 2-channel stereo film. He said it was only 2 channels because he said, I only have 2 hands. But then he went on and made, in King Lear and Histoire du Cinéma and all of his other films, 4-channel films, which implies that he has 4 hands now. And what he does with that is really quite extraordinary. Extraordinary in the sense that sound effects and music are given as much importance as dialogue, and that everything is subject to being interrupted or overtaken by other channels and other kinds of sound. Whereas what happens with it visually, I think, in his later work is he becomes closer and closer to being like a classical artist in certain ways. That the examples of classical painting are more important to him, and you could see this tendency beginning with around the time of, especially I think, Passion, when he's literally making a film about someone else making a film based on classical paintings. I don't know. I think it's. I'm being a little random in some of my observations here, but I think it's very hard because I think when we're talking about Godard today, we're talking about work that's still in progress, and I think that gives it a special excitement, but it also makes it harder for us as critics to kind of like come to terms with it.
Look, you prefer early Godard's work, but how do you deal with? He has been always changing and experimenting and even doing things against his previous work. But could you tell us what do you prefer, and why do you prefer some of the earlier work?
Well,
like,
I don't know if it's.
no.
I mean, I would say part of what it has to do with is my being a critic and the fact that Godard is closer to his origins as a critic in his early films, and therefore I can relate to them that way, because and as I think I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, he was the first of filmmakers really to make films that work film criticism in a certain way. That the first one who basically said there is no difference between making a film and writing a review of a film. I think there's some ways in which this is still true, but it's less true. It's less the case, I think. Also, that there was a certain way in which he was still wedded to Hollywood genres in the early parts of his career, and he was actually trying to remake Hollywood genres. I mean, Une Femme est une Femme was conceived of as a neorealist musical, and Bande à part is, of course, a crime thriller, as is Breathless. And you could even say he saw the art film as a genre, because Vivre sa vie, in a way, is his version.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask Luc about, because he has written for the Criterion edition.
Oh yes, Vivre sa vie.
About Vivre sa vie.
And of course, but just to continue a little bit the list, La Carabiniere is his version of the war film. I think the idea of genre is less operative in the work he does now. It's really the genre of the last works are the Godard film, that he's created a new genre in a certain way.
And Jean-Luc?
And Vive sa vie is the expose movie, the underworld USA model. But it's, Godard, it's a bit like certain modern composers, and I fail to bring one to mind, but I know if I could come up with names later, who begin by making works that adhere to some kind of classical tradition, some kind of rhythmic continuity, some kind of melodic continuity, and then get more and more abstract later on. And so we tend to hold on to the ones that have elements of the familiar in that way. So that's the early Godard. It's movies as we knew them, but with a new critical approach. But the thing is, evaluating Godard, it's like it's a horizon whose ends are too far apart to see, and it'll take his death to be able to bring some kind of more integrated view of his entire career. It's the distance between À bout de souffle and the last movies he's made is just so, it seems like it spans about 3 careers. And I just, I'm left mostly with questions, such as, almost every innovative filmmaker of the last 50 years has in some way come out of Godard. Everybody, Jarmusch, all these people owe a great deal to Godard. But that's the early Godard. How will or has the later Godard proved influential? I'm curious about that. I'm also curious about, has anyone really done a comparative study between Godard and Chris Marker and their approaches to the essay film? They're the 2 primary makers of the essay film, and how they differ. I could, take an individual Godard film and write an essay about it, but when I consider the whole of Godard, I have more questions than I have answers.
I think one way one can distinguish in a very general way between Chris Marker and Godard is that Chris Marker is above all a writer, it seems to me, a writer who also is a photographer. But Godard is, by his own admission, I think, is mainly a director. he even said to me in an interview, he said, I think I'm not a very good screenwriter, but I think I can be a good director. And I think that whereas with Chris Marker belongs to the tradition of French cinema as literature by another means, whereas with Godard, literature is one of the many arts. It's in other words, it's an art like painting or like music or like sculpture or like dance, and it only belongs to literature in that sense, although Godard also harks back to the tradition of cinema's literature. And for example, Deux fois 50 ans de cinéma français, because there he sort of concludes with a whole list of writers from Diderot to Serge Danet, and seeing that as really being part of cinema. So it's in that sense, but it's the critical sort of thing. And it's also significant, of course, that throughout his entire career, Chris Marker only made 2 fiction films, really. Both of them, interestingly enough, science fiction.
Well, but you know, Godard, I mean, of course, Godard, it's true, he's a director, it's primarily visual and auditory too, rather than text-based. However, he brought text into movies more than anybody back in his early days. You know, characters stepping in front of the camera and quoting at length, or people writing on blackboards. You know, there's just enormous amounts of quotations directly from texts, and I can't think of an immediate precedent to that.
No, and in fact, we talked in the session yesterday about that, about the fact that, at least I think he's well, he went even beyond that. He was the first director who said you can include anything in a film, basically. And in fact, other kinds of works of art, apart from literature, become texts also. But it's also that they're very kind of an abbreviated sense. I mean, Truffaut said that when he first got to know Godard, and he would go over to a person's apartment, he would immediately go to the library and start picking books off the shelf, but he would always read the first sentence and the last sentence of each book, and then he would put the book back in. And the way he would go to films was very similar. Which was a method adopted later by the American critic Manny Farber, that he would go in the middle of a film and watch 20 minutes and then leave. A little bit like the methodology of film viewing of the surrealists, who would sort of like go into films for a little while and then leave and say, you know, and it would be by chance, again, the idea of chance, of whatever you happen to see in that period, and that becomes the essence of the thing.
Then, of course, that brings your first thought thing brings to mind one of my 2 favorite domestic fights in movies, which is that argument between Anna Karina and Jean-Pierre Brialy, I forget who, in Une femme est une femme, where they fight by showing each other the titles of paperback books. Petrified mummies.
Yeah. João Mário Grilo.
I'm going to, no, I can speak in English, it's okay. I will try to introduce a small idea, which is, I think, a point for debate. I don't believe there is different Godards. I think what is different is not Godard, is the world. And in fact, there is a big theme around Godard, which is the theme of contemporaneity. Okay? What is to be a contemporary? And there is a very interesting thing. It's that a lot of contemporary philosophers, that means philosophers that try to understand contemporaneity, have been Godard spectators. Okay? So they have linked, and I speak about Badiou, which appears in Film Socialisme, but also Agamben, Jean-Luc Nancy, Esposito. That kind of people have been, as students, when they were students of philosophy, they have been spectators of Godard, and I think Godard has thought about film as a philosopher thinks about philosophy. And I think this theme can be be discussed because I remember when I was a kid, Godard, there was a sentence that everybody quoted in every newspaper, that Godard was 10 years after, 10 years in front.
Ahead.
And ahead. And by fortune, I was, the first film I saw, first Godard film I saw was number 2. And so I saw number 2 without knowing exactly what was number 1. And that film was made in 75, and in Portugal we have lived a revolution in 74. And what was incredible for me is that I was in the time of militant cinema, so cinema made for fight, and that film was for me much more revolutionary than those films. And it was more revolutionary by displacing time. Okay?
Yes.
And there is an important thing for me. What is most important in that is the question of method, because I think Godard has a methodology to understand the world. And I remember a very, very beautiful text from Louis Aragon that wrote in 65 exactly, a movie review of Pierre Lefou.
Yes.
And in that is an extraordinary text. And in that movie review, he linked Godard with Delacroix. And he explained why a particular painting by Delacroix is more the Sardanapal, is Sardanapal's death. He explained how the objective of Delacroix was to put order in the disorder. So instead of making like an Hollywood film, that is, have a world creating the disorder and solving it by a script, what Godard tries to make is work with the disorder and try to make that disorder understandable to us in terms of an order. Okay? So it's a completely different dramaturgy. And so, to provoke a little debate, I will say that what has changed is the world is always changing, and Godard, he has passed by different phases because the world is different. In 68 in France is not the same thing as in 63. And the revolution, the Portuguese Revolution has happened. And now Portugal is a social-democratic country. And that's a big change also. And what I think Godard is making, and it's a very, very important, for me, the most important work he has made in the last years is Histoire du Cinéma. Okay? Because Histoire du Cinéma is a refusal to think about time. In Portuguese, the term contemporary has the word time inside, which doesn't happen in English.
Yes.
And I think to be a contemporary is to work with time, to work with the time. And Histoire du Cinéma is something that is out of that linear projection of time as something that comes from history. And all these films for me is a challenge to that idea that we can make an history. It's impossible to make an history. Yes. And that's why it's so irregular and with the fractures.
I think that's very interesting, and it occurs to me that one can see a very important, I think, even if unexpected, link between Histoire du Cinéma and Le Mépris, Contempt, because they're both multilingual films that are like palimpsests, in a sense, that you get all these different layers which correspond, in a sense, to different historical periods that are overlaid with each other. In the same way that you have the juxtaposition of the Greece of Homer with the contemporary filmmaking scene, for example. In the same sort of way, you really have all the different periods of film history overlapping each other in Histoire du Cinéma. And of course, this being overlapped also with the history of painting, you know, other histories too, it seems to me, and of course the history of the 20th century.
It's incredible. It's
Yes.
very important, that idea of palimpsest, because to be contemporary is to be able to deal with time. That means every time is present, and is not history that tells us what is the beginning and the end. That's why the palimpsest
Yes.
as an editing system also is very important. Right. Okay.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I saw just a YouTube video about one of those famous public interventions of Godard that reminds me the disagreements and agreements of this table, which was he was Godard during the 80s, in the early 80s. He was invited to speak in a public television, maybe TF1, about one of his 80s films. I don't know which one, and he was there, you know, in the studio, and the host of the TV made him a question about his film, but he didn't want to speak about it. He wanted to speak about the newsreels, the previous newsreels that had happened before his intervention, and they were talking about the Malvin Wars between Argentina and England, and apparently in the newsreel, the host said something about the state of the war today. There are some contradictory informations, and he spoke about the contradictory informations. And Godard said, "Hey, man, what you said about these contradictory informations, aren't you ashamed of this? You should say, we don't know what is happening in Malvin Wars, in Malvin Islands." And the other guy was trying to escape of that, you know, saying, but we have different informers, we have different sources, and we have to give all the sources. And Godard was like, "No, man, you have to say, we don't know what happened. You please say that." No, not please, even without the please. Say that, you know. You know, Godard was very assertive. So he forced the host, TV man to say, "Okay, Jean-Luc, I will say that we don't know what's going on with the Malvin Wars today. Are you happy?" "Yes, I'm happy." So we don't know what's going on with Godard, no? It's like more or less the same situation here, no? He's so vast, and in a way, the way I see Godard, it's I think that like arts and disciplines, this is a bit esoteric, no? But regulate themselves, and finally they found their own doctor that ends up to appear, no? So in medicine, Freud appeared and diagnosed the illness of the medicine, no? In music, I think maybe Pierre Boulez appeared, and maybe he was the one you were referring before, and in the beginning, he did his own music, maybe classical, you know, more or less contemporary, and then he rethought all the history and did some mashup with it. In literature, and I think is the closest you know, family to Godard, of course, I always think of Borges, no? Jorge Luis Borges. And for me, they are like cousins, no? In fact, the fact that the last sentence of the Histoire du Cinéma is that famous sentence of Borges, "I was that man," you know, gives a clue, you know, makes this relationship like more explicit, no? So I think both Borges and Godard, they did his own poetry before coming to terms with the art and diagnosed the illnesses, and they invented some illnesses that didn't exist about cinema, and they were like, they were both doctors, and they said this is what is going on with cinema. For example, Godard said, "Cinema is worthless because it was not," this famous sentence, "it was not inside of the concentration camps, so everything we've done till now is worthless, so we have to rethink history with this, you know?" Godard is that kind of self-conscious poet, and yeah, that's it. And I wanted to maybe ask you something, which is a doubt that I always have when I see the Godard films, which is, of course, he, especially in the 70s, when he does this gigabyte of films for the workers, you know, for the working class, you know. The problem that always comes to my mind is that isn't the language, the way he speaks to the audience is, you know, he's anti-popular, so to speak. No, this happens. This could happen also with Jean-Marie Straub, but I think it's a different approach, like more. But in the way of Godard, he's talking to the public, but that working class would never go to a Godard film. And if they went, they would probably come out of the room, no, the cinema room. So it's like being hermetic, and this brings me some problems that I think that he's talking to people which are in factories. For example, remember Tu vas bien, which is one of his more accessible films, no? But after that, it gets more and more complex, and the shots are very long, and you have to be absolutely, so to speak, trained, no? And I would like to know what you think about this apparent contradiction, if it is a contradiction.
To some extent, it's a reflection of the class he comes from, too, I think. In other words, that he comes from a working class, I mean, a upper class background, and wealthy, and also perhaps a sense of in-betweenness, because, I mean, people think often of him as French, but in fact he's Swiss French, which is different. But I think that it seems to me that the Ziga Vertov period testifies to his failure to address workers. I mean, basically, and to address active politics in a way also, because it seems to me that for me, the best political film the two best political films he made in that period are Ici et ailleurs, which is a film about his failure in politics, really, and Numero 2, which is an attempt to sort of like, it's Numero 2 because it's a second starting point. I think that's what, at least to me, what justifies it. The commercial reason for calling it Numero 2 was it was supposed to be a remake of Breathless because it had exactly the same budget as Breathless. That was the only, and I think there's a scene of somebody pissing in a sink. Yeah. So that's the only link, really. But in fact, I remember the week that Numero 2 opened in Paris. I was there, and I went to see it in a big cinema right off Champs-Élysées, and I was the only one inside the cinema. Which was quite what is extraordinary, of course, is the fact that it was playing in all these cinemas, which is very bizarre. But this has been the weird kind of relationship he has with companies like Gaumont. I mean, Gaumont, who on the one hand helped to finance Histoire de Cinema, on the other hand, release Histoire de Cinema in mono, which is like capitalist censorship, which, by the way, Cahiers du Cinema also did with Nouvelle Vague. They released Nouvelle Vague on mono, which is an active distortion of the work. I mean, you can't really perceive what it's doing if you see it in mono. And it seems to me kind of extraordinary that it's one of the peculiarities of France that you have, on the one hand, the mechanism to distribute certain things more widely, but that doesn't necessarily come with an understanding of what the work is, so that in a certain way it becomes mutilated before it reaches the public.
And, the problem with those political movies, Pravda, British Sounds, Vladimir and Rosa, it was a whole period where the entire left was tripping over its shoelaces trying to address the working class, having no idea, either producing abstruse documents like this or else active condescension. And I mean, in a way you have to give Godard credit for not condescending, for refusing to condescend. Nevertheless, those movies were hard to watch then. I saw some at the time, and they're even harder now because the memory of those specific struggles has receded so far into the past. But on the other hand, in a more generally not so pointedly political way, a movie like Weekend seems much more accessible now than upon its release. I think the world has kind of come to resemble Weekend more than the world resembled that movie then. So, it may be that the world will come to accept some of the later work of Godard, having absorbed the methods and the cinematic language. This is possible too. But nevertheless, also on the political Godard, he's followed everywhere from me by this tin can of a phrase attached to his shoelace, le plus court des Suisses pro-chinois. He hitched his wagon to a particularly bad horse in those days.
Well, I think one thing that I think is interesting is not only the changing, accessibility of his works. I mean, if you compare what the Mépris or Contempt looks like to people now with what it looked like when it came out, it's quite extraordinary because people look at it as a classical work of art now, when it was a total aberration and considered ridiculous by a lot of people when it came out. But I think that there's also a real misperception in the West of what political, sort of like progressive art was in the 60s, because from the vantage point of today, I think the really radical work politically and formally all came from Eastern Europe in that period. It was Makoveyev, it was Yangsho, it was Shitilova, there were all these, but for some reason, maybe because there was not enough understanding in the West of what was happening in those countries, the model became, Godard. And Godard was lagging behind, I think, in relation, politically and formally, in relationship to the kind of things that were being done in Eastern Europe.
Jean-Marc, do you want to add anything?
It's more kind of funny testimony, because each year I screen bracelets for my students, and after the beginning, I show them also, after showing them the film, I show them the beginning of Bracelets, the Godard version, and the remake that has been made in the States in the 80s, with Richard Gere, yes, which is a very sympathetic film, so it's made with very good intentions. And what is incredible is that everybody, and they are not particularly instructed to cinema, everybody tells that Bracelets, the original, is much more contemporary than the remake. And what I feel really, and Sante spoke about the idea of there is a world that is taking the form of Tout va bien. And I think what is difficult, because in the 60s everybody could see Godard films at the time they were made, and now that's not happening. There is a lot of, from 10 or 15 years, we cannot see in the commercial circuit a Godard film in back then. So there is no distributors for that. And what I think is that there is a difficulty to relate the actual world, that is the world made by the media, and the contemporary. And because it's difficult to relate it, you block it. And there is no more, there is no intermediaries. We have, and Jonathan knows that film lives by complicity. We have accomplices in the world. And Godard lives, but there is a lot of people that have disappeared. So the accomplices, we are missing the accomplices to build the ways to maintain Godard in the screens. And this is very important because we are speaking about actual Godard that in reality we don't see anymore, except in the festivals like that.
No, the last film, Socialism and Adio Langage, they have been distributed, but of course they have been 2 weeks on screen. That's true.
But I think we also have to recognize that Godard's relationship to what's contemporary in culture has changed quite a bit, because I was really struck when I saw Detective again recently that there's a long passage which deals with the internet, which was, you know, like in computers and stuff like this. Like this is like in the 80s, and yet if you look at films today by Godard, he's not interested in the internet. It's almost like he's gone past that or backwards from that, but it's not. He's not engaging with what we could call the contemporary in the same way that he was. You know.
I don't feel that internet is contemporary. I think internet is actual, but not contemporary.
I see what you're saying.
Is another thing.
Yeah.
Okay. That like Andy Warhol, he was inventing contemporary that was actual 10 years after.
Yeah.
You understand? And is really perhaps one of the sole contemporary filmmakers in the world. That is, he is working 10 years ahead. Like I think there is another guy, Pishatung.
Yeah.
Which is for me a contemporary filmmaker, because he is dealing with materials that we don't feel really the presence now, but we feel that there is something there which is going to be explained thereafter. Do you understand what I mean? And that's why important, there is a revolution there. That's why for me in Portugal, number 2 was so important, because it doesn't speak about what is happening now. He is speaking about what is going to happen in 10 years after now, because the elements are there. You know, the elements that are going to be actual in 10 years, they are there now. And that's the same thing that Aragon spoke about Delacroix.
Yeah.
Okay, because he's...
No, I understand what you're saying. And maybe in order to achieve that, Godard has to be alone, because because that's what I mean is that in a sense, when he started out in the 60s, he wasn't alone. He was very much part of a community, the community of Cahiers du Cinema, the community of a new kind of cinephilia, which was global, almost. And the fact is that he has to retreat from that collectivity in order to maybe reach what's going to be happening 10 years from now.
Yeah, but you know, that idea, the very, very beautiful letter that he wrote to Truffaut after Day for Night.
Yes.
Okay, which is a rejecting letter.
Yeah.
And he tells that Truffaut, the term, I don't, is reclining, you know. Truffaut is, como é que se diz este termo, não é? Quer dizer, que caiu, não é? He fall in the trap.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that movement, the building of isolation, is also a movement of rejection.
Yes.
From the cinema people, because he's not there. He's not
only just the
cinema
people, but cities too.
Cinema people, because I think the real community, the real Godard community, is not a community nor of filmmakers or cinephiles. It's a community of thinkers.
Yes.
That's why the philosophers like Agamben, Exposito, etc., the contemporary philosophers, are part of that community.
Well, of course, in many of his even earliest films, he has philosophers speaking.
Yes.
I mean, Brice Perrin, yeah.
But the Badiou presence in socialism is very important.
Yeah.
Because he's pointing something there. He's pointing that the real connection is made not with the actors, the star people,
yes,
but he's making it with I would say communists, really. So people that are problematizing the world.
Do you remember the intervention of Roger Lénard in Une Femme Mariée?
Yes.
It's absolutely startling, and he gives like a clue to understand the absurdity of the world, which is not absurdity at all, which is something. He gives like a definition of intelligence, and he says that intelligence is like understanding before stating something, and it was really great. And yes, but sometimes I think that's it. Godard is a filmmaker for thinkers, as Borges for other filmmakers or cinephiles, and yeah, it's like for a very closed community, no, so to speak. Like you have to be initiated. No? It's like
the communists have cells,
cellulose or cells. Yeah. Cells. Yeah. It's for cells.
Jonathan spoke about the quotations.
Yeah.
I think the quotation system is part of that. Because when he quotes someone, he puts the words of someone in the words of an actor, he's pointing a connection.
Yeah.
He's pointing a connection. And that connection, for me, is completely coherent.
Yeah.
Completely coherent. And now, in fact, we can perhaps understand, seeing the late Godard films, why Trump is the President of the United States.
Yeah. In fact, that Roger Leonard intervention in 1964, I saw it the next day of the Trump thing, and it was like balsamic, It led to comprehension to even all the voters of Trump in a very, very balsamic way. It was marvelous. And but I like the thing that you said that Godard and his mates and pals of the Nouvelle Vague shot films like if they made critics. That's a very interesting point. And I wanted maybe ask Jonathan, don't you think that in the United States, in Hollywood, there's a kind of parallel, filmmaker, which is Brian De Palma, which in a way he did the same thing. He made Brian De Palma. He made like Hitchcock, the best Hitchcock critics, not written but shot in a way, but he did it with the tools that Godard provided to comment on cinema in images. This is something I always used to think.
Well, that's hard for me to see because I don't see a critical intelligence in Brian De Palma.
Don't really?
I see a postmodernist. I see nothing but postmodernist homage, but I don't see a critical commentary because to me most of what's interesting in Hitchcock is not in De Palma, for me, and that's the problem. I think if he's a critic of Hitchcock, he's a bad critic. Whereas I don't know, a film we haven't talked about, but what seems to me very important or very relevant to our discussion is Alphaville, because Alphaville is the first science fiction film in which the present tense becomes the basis. And you can say that he changed science fiction as a genre too, because even like George Lucas's first film, THX 1138, would not have been possible without Alphaville. And you can think of a lot of other cases of that too. In other words, seeing the present as being in the future, basically.
And what do you think, because his work has been so influential and in many fields, not only cinema, Miguel Marias, yesterday, he referred to an inquiry in El País some weeks ago when they were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the newspaper, and they inquired some young filmmakers in Spain and about their influences, and no one mentioned Godard. And this question would go also to you because you teach and many future filmmakers.
Maybe it's because young filmmakers are not interested in as interested in philosophy and the kind of reflections of old men. I mean, what Godard was associated one time with youth, and now he's associated with wisdom. And I think those are very different. I think it has something to do with that.
And there is, for me, it is the conflict. Is the conflict between in what time are you belonging? You belong to what time? And,
Yes.
And I think the media is the real enemy, the real Godard enemy.
Yeah.
Because the media is pushing the world in the actual. And of course that, like internet, of course like young people are connected with the idea of history and time, which is completely connected with that idea that there is the actual and the past. And in fact, when you see Histoire du Cinéma, he's telling that there is the past, the present, and the future, and you can pass between time. And that is being with the time. And of course, it's very difficult for someone that was taught that you must learn history and you must place people in their time. So Godard, of course, is an old guy.
Yeah.
But in fact, he is really is in a time that is out of joint, and it's very difficult for someone to understand. But it was difficult already. Number two is not an easy film. It's a film made with small screens, and the editing is made in the screen, so it's a very boring film. But you must pay the price, and if you want to be in your time, you must pay the price to see boring things, read boring things, etc., etc. And it's not an ecology of distraction, because people are distracted now. And Godard is a guy from the perception, which is completely different.
Well, I remember being very angry at the time of Numero 2 came out, because the people who wrote for Screen Magazine in England, who worshipped the Giga Vertov films because they could explain everything on a blackboard and saying, you know, this is counter cinema and this is dominant cinema. They basically completely rejected and didn't know what to do with Numero 2. I can remember the American experimental filmmaker Yvonne Rainer said, bare ass is bare ass, I don't give a goddamn how many video screens you show it on. And that was her, you know, that was her review of Numero 2. I mean, it was like, the fact is that was about what signification was, and, you know, which was going much more deep. It was actually addressing the concerns that the people on screen claimed to have, which was about how do you make meaning. Yes. But they couldn't see it because you couldn't explain it on a blackboard, you know, which was what they were doing, because they were all academics. I mean, and I think we also have to realize that the enemy of a lot of our understanding of cinema is the Academy, because, I mean, it's like Godard maybe deals with the contemporary, but academia deals is a geological time, basically. I mean, you know, it's like, it's and it comes out in all sorts of ways. I mean, you know, like to publish a book in Europe takes a month or two, in the United States takes a year. Not because they're working the whole year, but because they're twiddling their thumbs for, you know, 11 months.
Because of the publicity schedule. The editor system.
I think we could now open up the discussion to the audience. Do you have anything you want to add or to ask? Or? Yes?
What are these forms from the future that you can see in Godard's and Apichatpong's films? What do you think? Besides sensing them, can you phrase them? Can you?
Maybe I could say that there is the term of intelligence, which is not real. We cannot diagnose that as a form. I think it's more system, and so everything is part of that. We cannot isolate a particular figure in a Godard film or Apichatpong. I think it's more in what passes from one point to the other point. It's like, you know, that the contraposition history between the system of history as an explanation, and people that work with history, like Godard, in my opinion, as more blackboards, and you can switch things. And the real thing, the contemporary thing, is the switching, not the forms. It's the system that permits the switching. And that is very political, of course, very political. And it puts people in an anachronic situation. And for me, anachronism is the most important feature in Godard, but it's not an original from Godard, because there is an anachronic way of thinking about time and history from the French Revolution. So, and what the people he quotes in the films are part of that anachronic way of producing the idea of time and history, which is placing ourselves in the world. So it's more in the system, I see. And it's very important, the gadget also. I was mixing a film in the same studio where Godard's in Bern, where Godard mixes. And he never goes to the final mix with more than 2 tracks. So every sound is edited. And that's why we don't have sweet mixings in Godard. And for me, so a music disappears. It doesn't fade, it disappears, because the sound ended. And for me, that technical system, that language system, is part of that anachronic way of thinking. Of course, that cinema is not a powerful medium to that. So he's struggling with the technique. And Histoire du Cinéma is really, the forms, they are born from a system that is oppressing them. I don't know if
I wanted to ask you about your opinion of the 2 extended TV series that Godard did for French television, because that's where you really get a confrontation between the actual and the contemporary. And I mean, he considered them failures, but they were definite attempts to engage with French television culture. I'm just wondering how you evaluate them.
No, I evaluate them exactly in that way. How can I explain it in English? The English support during 1 hour, but after is very heavy. But I will, for me, what is very interesting in that Godard moment is the way the images, the way he shows the modes of apparition of images. So you have an image, and there is another image that is born in.
Yes.
And the layer is, and this is for me, of course, I was very important synchronicity with that system. And for me, that idea of being synchronous with Godard is very important. So because
yes. I mean, I like the second series very much, because when he interviews these children, he allows himself to be contradicted. I remember there's a wonderful moment when he, as a little girl, isn't television like looking at a shop window in a department store? And she says, no.
Does he has a special actor to play in his movies, or not particular? The casting is not very important in his films. I would like to know. I would like to know if he has any particular actors that he wants to.
He had several. Several.
Now, but I think you mean now in these latest films.
Yes.
No actors anymore. Just presence. No philosophers.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is very important, because you must be away from the system. I think he's...
Yeah, there was a kind of a disagreement I had with Paulo Branco in the first session because I said that Godard hated stars in a certain kind of way, and he disagreed with me and said that it was really that Godard was just someone who took the money and ran, but he wasn't like he had a. But I feel that there's a certain kind of way in which, whenever he has a film with stars and he appears, he's like this curmudgeon. He makes himself ludicrous. Like in King Lear, he does this, and in Prenum Carmen, he does this.
Uncle.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. But then he becomes much more benign when he's the star, like in, Swan d'Adoat, for example. So I think it has something to do with, he doesn't like to. He knows that the stars are what allow him to finance the film and to attract films, but then he does things to sabotage them, like Depardieu, for example. And
I think that the system he uses, which is a very cooperative system, I work with an actress that worked with him in Detective. And he divides the team in two parts, the good part and the bad part of the crew, okay?
Yes.
And this is completely arbitrary. So there is no reason for that.
yeah,
And some actors are in the bad part, that means that they don't receive at the end of the week. They are insulted every time. And this is a system for dividing the crew. So impeaching that there is connections between people that can rise to influence the film, and is provoking a disagreement, and so destabilizing completely what is the corporative identity in film, where everybody is friend of everybody. Of course, the actors, the stars, cannot accept a system like that. Like Isabelle Adjani in Passion, when she was forced to work in a factory, she left the film because she could not use makeup, and so I think it's like in Hitchcock, where the actors are like cows.
cattle, yeah.
Cows. There is a more beautiful term in English for that. I don't remember. The cattle.
Cattle, yeah.
Yeah, and the last film maybe he made with a well-known actor was Hélas pour moi, from '93.
Yeah.
In fact,
think the actor-
in his last film, the main character is a dog. So
His dog, yeah.
that's it.
If there aren't further questions, thank you all. This is the end of the Godard Symposium. Today there are some films that are going to be screened if you have missed anyone or want to see. Thank you all. Obrigado.
Thank you so much.